So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joshua Swamidass.
I'll look forward to meeting the real Dan Chow one day, yes. Thanks for having me today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this. My name is Josh Swamidass. As I was eloquently explained, I'm here both from Washington University and also Peaceful Science. You can find both of those websites there, and if you're curious in following me, Peaceful Science is a great way to do that. Today we're going to be dealing with one of the grand questions, one of the great questions, one of the questions that have guided all great philosophy and literature and art, and at the center of so much that we think about in medicine and in science. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? And we're going to look at this from two different angles. One of them is by looking at apes and humans, and then looking at artificial minds. Now, the way I approach this, just to be clear, is from a particular point of view. I'm a scientist and a Christian. Now, the thing about this question about what it means to be human is that it's a deep question. It's one of the profound questions. It's one of the great questions. We're not going to fully answer it. And maybe even as I talk about things, you might even disagree. That's one of the features about what makes it so grand. It just sucks you in and it keeps you there. So it also tells us a little bit about who we are and how we answer it. For me, I'm a scientist. I work full-time every day, except for when I'm in places like Hong Kong right now, doing science, because I love it. I found myself there. I have a small team of graduate students and postdocs and all that sort of stuff, and we go off as a little band of explorers trying to discover new things about how the world works. And that's how I've come to see so much of the world. At the same time, I'm a Christian. I'm a person who encountered this person named Jesus, and he makes a lot of sense to me, and I decided to follow him. And so there's things that came with that really impact how I see what it means to be a human too. So that's my starting point, and that's going to come through. We're going to be going back and forth between all of those, because in a lot of ways it seems like science and this sort of this faith might be in conflict. You might be wondering that. For me, I've seen an interesting interplay and harmony between the two, and hopefully you'll see some of that too. Let's start with the story about apes and humans. So there's me. I'm the example, in case you're confused. I'm the example of a human there. The other one is an example of a great ape. There's a chimpanzee. There's other great apes too. There's orangutans. There's bonobos. And there's gorillas. Those are the ones that are alive. But there's also more as you go back in time. And they're our closest relatives. They're the closest thing we find to us in the animal kingdom. And one way we can get at this question of how it is to think about what it means to be human is think about what makes us different from them. Or are we even different? Fundamentally, we can ask, are we just another type of animal or another type of ape? You can see on the left these busts made by an artist at the Smithsonian Institute of different types of humans we see as we go back in time. I say humans very loosely here because in science, it might be surprising to find this out, but we don't even have a precise definition of what human is scientifically. At times people have said Homo sapiens, meaning the species that all of us are, but there's remains that we find in the ground that we can't really tell precisely if they're Homo sapien or not. And there's a grand debate about whether or not Neanderthals are human too. They're clearly different than us, but are they human too? It's also common to say that humans are the genus Homo, or the Homo genus, meaning we kind of expand out. We think of things all the way back to Homo erectus about 2 million years ago. And, you know, H. antecessor, there's a whole menagerie of these creatures we found. But we even get to them confusing cases where we're not sure if they're homogeneous or not. What's surprising about it is when we look at our world today, it's so easy to say who is a human and who's not. It is the simplest thing in the world. We know who is a human and who is not. When we go back in time, we find out we don't have a definition for it, and even for any definition we find, we cannot easily figure out precisely where the line stands. That's a fundamental feature of the world. So that's one reality there that I face as a scientist. The other reality that I face as a Christian is what I read in the Bible. And there's a story in the first few chapters. It's not the most important story. The most important story doesn't come first. It comes in the middle. And it's about Jesus. But let's leave the Jesus story aside for a moment. The first story is about about how humans are made. And it seems to tell the story about God coming down, reaching down, grabbing up a bunch of mud and dust, and forming this man and breathing life into him. And he's made in God's image. And he looks around, talks to a lot of other animals, naming them, finds out there's no worthy partner. And so God then takes his rib and forms a woman out of it. That is the other story. It couldn't get more different, it seems, from the story I learned in science. The scientific story tends to emphasize the continuity between us and other animals. The story of the Bible seems to emphasize the discontinuity, the break, and how we're so different. Let me give you an example of how that plays out in science. So here we're talking about humans, or of mice and men. Do you know that phrase? It's a classic phrase from literature. So there's a man up there and a mouse. Once again, just to be clear, that's the man up there. And there's a chimpanzee and a rat. Now, one thing we can do to objectively measure how similar these are, we can sit down and figure out how similar two animals' genomes are. This is pretty important. So when I graduated undergrad is when the human genome was first sequenced. And then 5 years later, in 2005, that is when the chimpanzee genome was first sequenced. At that point, also the mouse and the rat genome were sequenced. They'd been sequenced a little bit earlier. And we can now ask, how similar are these genomes to one another? There's many ways to measure that, but one important way, probably the first way it was ever measured, we see a pattern that ends up holding up whatever way we look at it. We find this. So humans and chimpanzees are 98% the same. 2% different by this measure. Mice and rats are 80% similar, or 20% different. These are approximate numbers, but essentially, by this measure, mice and rats are 10 times more different than humans and chimpanzees. But look at them. That mouse and that rat, they look pretty similar, don't they? Now, if you're biologists who have actually worked in the lab, you might be saying, oh, no. They actually really behave differently. That might be true. But it's not that surprising to think that the two of them are similar. And certainly, we must be much more different than a chimpanzee. And this ends up being a very bizarre puzzle in the world. So how do we make sense of that? It turns out there's a mathematical formula that arises in evolutionary science, evolutionary biology, that makes sense of it. It turns out that when we look at the fossil record, it seems like humans and chimpanzees separated a lot more recently in history than mice and rats. And also, we can go measure how quickly they're mutating. We find out that mice and rats tend to mutate quicker. So they've been separating from one another for a longer period of time, and they're moving quicker as they do it. So that's why they're farther apart than us. And we don't necessarily have to agree with evolution or that, but that's just a fact. It's a brute fact that we have like a way to explain that mathematically. And this is one of the key things that helped me rethink how I even thought about evolution, even though I've been raised in a different way to not really give credence to it. And now, as a scientist, I really think that it's true. I think that we share common ancestry. That's common, and that actually kind of is a different story than saying we're distinct. It actually means that in some ways we're cousins. There's other things that we learn from science too. These three types of human are the same species. You might think that that's a simple idea, or maybe you even disagree with me. But it turns out, and this is a surprising thing, that we can go out to any part of the world and all of us are the same biological type. There was a time where people might have doubted about everyone here. There was a time where people thought, well, there's a difference between civilized man and uncivilized. And what we found, though, is that you could take a child from this tribal person in Africa, or from really a tribal person anywhere, including someone from India or wherever. You could take them, that child, and then raise them in a civilized place like Hong Kong or the West. If you gave them all the advantages that a person has here, and then watched what happened, and they come to Hong Kong University, and that kid, and he goes off, and then he goes off and has a career, would he be any different than any of you? In fact, you wouldn't be able to tell. So what we see as differences turn out not actually to be biological differences, they're much more about culture. Now what's remarkable about this, there's another grand puzzle that arises out of this too. We can go back in time and we can imagine what would happen. Now we can't exactly go back, we can go back as a thought experiment. And we could pluck a person from 10,000 years ago, or maybe 20,000 years ago, almost certainly 40,000 years ago, take that person, that child, fast forward time, put him in our context and ask, what would happen with him? And we're pretty sure for that kid, and we don't know how far back precisely, I mean, maybe we go back as far as 100,000 years ago, or 70,000 years ago, we take that child, we put him here, and it would be no different. That means, think about this, the amazing fact of this. That means that all the genetic capability, all the biological capability for math, for physics, for art, for playing the piano, for music, for language, for using an iPhone, for entering into society exists tens of thousands of years before it actually comes. How does that happen? We don't have a good account of that in science. It seems like humans are ready for something that's definitive that doesn't actually come until much, much later. In fact, I learned of a man named Lang Lang. Yeah, he's that guy right there. There's an interesting puzzle here, you know. He's famous for playing music. I actually watched a video of him playing Pachelbel's Canon, which I think that was a German composer. And he's famous for playing music, and we have him playing German music, even though the pianos weren't in Asia until what, maybe 50 to 100 years ago? I don't know exactly when they came here. But somehow, it's not genetics, it's not biology that allows us to be that grand or great at something. There's something else going on. We're all the same type of human. Now, I say we're really similar, but we look a little bit closer, we start to see some differences. And one of the more surprising ones is that other animals, for the most part, don't have grandparents. Now, you might say, well, that's not true. Everyone has parents, and everyone's parents have parents, so therefore they have grandparents. What I mean is they don't have a concept of grandparents. This is my father. I probably shouldn't have to specify which one. And that's my 2-year-old son. He's almost 3 years old now. That's a really special photo. That was last November. And then a few months later, my father died. And so I really treasure this photo. So Caleb, my son, met my father, his grandfather, right? This simple interaction of my father seeing me as his son and seeing my son as connected to him is one of those things that's nearly distinctly human. Now, there's a couple exceptions, sort of. So if you look at killer whales, they have a concept of grandmother, probably, because they have a female unit in their pods that are long, and they live long enough to be multi-generational. Elephants are the same way too. But at the same token, because the males in those species spend time in different places, they don't actually know their grandchildren. So they have a concept of grandmother, but not of grandfather. So this basic thing of deeply caring for your grandparents or wondering about your grandkids appears to be a nearly distinctly human thing. And can you imagine what it would be like to be human to not have a concept of that? I can't quite get my head around that yet. In fact, even Caleb, he's 2 years old. We're not sure precisely how much he's going to remember when he's older. But I know that eventually, one day, we're going to have conversations about my father, his grandfather, and even if he's forgotten a lot of the details, they're going to be meaningful to him in a way that we can be pretty certain is not true of any other animal we've seen. So this gets to be the beginning of like, yeah, there's continuity, but there's also discontinuities, there's differences. What happened in the prior generation of scientists is something called the Great Language Experiments. So one way how people have looked at humans being different is that we have language and everything else doesn't. That's not precisely true. It turns out that a lot of animals have language of one sort or another. The ones that we were most curious about were our closest relatives, the great apes. And if you've heard of Coco the gorilla, that's one of those gorillas, one of those great apes that was part of the language experiments. This was another one. His name was Nim Chimpsky. If you're laughing, the people who are laughing, it's because it sounds a little bit like Noam Chomsky. That was intentional. It wasn't an accident. It's because they were thinking about like hierarchies of language and what types of language can this chimpanzee get. Now, remembering this fact that all humans are the same species, you take this kid from the tribal kid from Africa, you put him, giving them all the advantages of Hong Kong, and they would become entirely like us. There was a question that arose, like, well, to what extent are chimpanzees just different because they don't have the same culture? And of course, they don't have the same biology. And that maybe the issue is they just can't vocalize the same way we will. So instead of trying to talk to them using our mouths, we'll just have them learn sign language. All right. And if we take a child, if we take this little kid, this chimpanzee, and we then raise him like a human child. And what happened is there was a professor, because only a professor would have a crazy idea like this. His wife had a kid too, so he said, like, let's adopt a chimpanzee. And he got a lot of graduate students to help be babysitters. And they took a lot of detailed notes on this little chimpanzee. This is just one of the great ape experiments. And they watched to see how human Nim Chimpsky could really be. Interesting question, right? It makes you wonder, maybe that might help us mark out how different we really are. What really is human? How continuous are we with the human kingdom? With this animal that's just 2% different than us in some important ways. What they found was remarkable. So yes, if you take a chimpanzee, raise him as a child, as a human, signing language to him, he's going to learn how to talk. He's going to be able to understand a lot of things. He'll be picking up language, in some ways really similar to humans, but then there's something that happens. It kind of stalls out. There's been a lot of studies. So one of the things that's really interesting about Nim is that they did really detailed records. So there've actually been studies where they've gone back and tried to see his rate of language acquisition and how the types of things he's learning, and compare that to how human children learn. There's a really good paper that was really interesting that looked at and asked the question, what about compound nouns? Now, I don't know how this works in Chinese, but everyone here listening to this speaks English, I hope, or you're just giving me a blank stare. A compound noun is we take two nouns, you put them together, and you get a new word that refers to something different. An example would be bathroom. We all know what a bath is. We all know what a room is, and so we could say bathroom. Now we have a new thing. We could say keychain. We know what a key is. We know what a chain is. We say keychain. And even if you've never ever heard the word keychain before, you can start to figure out, oh yeah, that's what it is, right? And in fact, if you have a kid, and I have a little kid, you can actually start to see them do that. They'll come up with new words, and they'll start putting them together to make sense of it. In fact, that's how a lot of these words started. There's actually a word for it, and I think it's French, because it sounds French. We'll find out if I'm right later. Portmanteau, where you take two words and you just kind of make them up, improvise them in the moment, put those two words together, and you have a new word. Compound nouns. And one thing that's really interesting about compound nouns is that it's a combinatorially large space. You add one new word, it doesn't just increase the amount of words you have by one word. And now it can combine with everything else. It basically doubles the number of words you can see. I mean, it just increases it a lot. So that's a combinatorial feature of language. It's one of the basic pieces of how grammar works. It's really critical. It's like one of the first things that you need to do to be able to start having a human language. So the question we can ask is, could Nim Chimpsky understand what a compound noun was? And it turns out the answer is no. And this is a profound thing, because my 1-year-old, when he was 1 year old, understood compound nouns. That means my 1-year-old was light years ahead of Nim Chimpsky, and he tried at it for years and couldn't succeed. Now, to be clear, he could learn something like a bathroom, but he wouldn't learn it as bath and room put together, reasoning to get that. He would get it as like, oh, it's a whole new word, bathroom. So he could learn compound nouns, but he couldn't learn the grammar by which to produce compound nouns. Do you get that? And that's an amazing thing, because that's one of the most basic things you can imagine in language. There's a lot more complex things. I mean, Noam Chomsky had a whole hierarchy of language and the grammar. It turns out that we can't get past even step 1, except by just memorizing every term. And so that's what we found out, essentially, from the great ape language experiments. We have a gradation of languages. Humans are here. Chimpanzees are just very different than us in this. In this particular story, as in all of them, it gets much worse. So this kid was raised not in a zoo among other chimpanzees, but around humans. He could never integrate into society, and there was no hope for him there. And it degrades horribly. And this actually turns into almost a type of animal abuse to this poor chimpanzee. He was not a happy chimpanzee. And he ends up finally, probably happiest he is, with other chimpanzees, even though he's behind bars. There's a movie on it. It's called Project Nim. I really encourage you to watch it. It's freely available on YouTube. That's what we find out from all of the great ape language experiments. Not all of them are as tragic as this one, but we get the sense that, our closest relatives to us are so similar to us. They're similar in ways that surprise us. Like, you can tickle chimpanzees and they'll laugh. They get gray hair. They take care of the elderly. They're so human like us in so many ways. They can sign language to us. We can actually have a conversation with them in sign language. Yet they don't have the full mind that we have. Actually, a way it's actually explained is they don't have a full theory of mind. And so this gets to Darwin's doubt and Dr. King's image of God. So this is Alfred Russel Wallace. He is the equal co-discoverer of evolution alongside Darwin. He sent Darwin a paper before he published The Origin of the Species, and they had the same idea. And Darwin credited him equally as a co-discoverer of it. And the reason why you don't hear about Alfred Russel Wallace is he had some weird stuff that happened in his life down the line. He kind of went down some strange paths. But one of the things that happened too is that the one doubt that he had about evolution was the human mind. How did that arise? He was thinking, without the same details we have, about this puzzle, about how is it that Lang Lang can play German music? How is that possible that the tribal child can go be taken to the United States and then be indistinguishable from everyone else in a generation? How is that possible? how is it possible that all of these things exist before they're there? I mean, our ability to deal with them exists before they're there. And when you look back at it from a grand historical point of view, the question gets heightened, because what you see over and over again is that there's really interesting animals in the distant past. My child really loves dinosaurs. We never see a human dinosaur. And I don't mean, you understand what I'm saying? We don't see one, I mean, obviously it wouldn't be human in the sense of necessarily having the same form of us, but they would have like cities, they would have iPhones of their own. They would have a civilization. And we never see a civilization arise ever in history until just maybe 10,000 years ago. Why is it? It's one of the grand puzzles of our moment. And then also when you think about how some of the most important progresses that happened, they are pointing to something greater. So Martin Luther King is really important in the United States. He reminded us when we were treating some humans like they weren't fully human, and others weren't, that we're all made in the image of God. Once again, coming back to this other story that I've heard, that maybe that there's something, maybe we're from somewhere, maybe we're from the dust, but maybe we're also something more too. Maybe we're pointing to something. Are we just another ape? Like I said, there's these two stories. This is what I've come to. I think we are apes. I think we're creatures of the dust. We're continuous with other animals. We are another animal. We're that. We're creatures. In theology, we would say creatures, created things. We'd say animals, meaning that we are animals. At the same time, we're more than just apes, more than just animals. We're exceptional in many ways. And I would say we're also made in the image of God. I'd say the two narratives end up being much more coherent than you might initially think. We're of the dust. When I talk to some people who are very offended by the notion of us descending from common ancestors with apes, they say, but it's an ape. That's so disgusting. I say, well, what's the alternative? It says the dust. I mean, ape is pretty amazing compared to dust. It's not so bad. I'm pretty impressed by apes. Of artificial minds. Now, I'm a scientist. I do artificial intelligence. My PhD is actually in computer science, and I use this to apply this to chemistry, biology, and medicine to solve problems there. I sit in the interface of all these fields. I was really curious about machine learning and artificial intelligence when I was an undergrad, and then I started my PhD in 2002. And I started doing this thing with neural networks that has ended up following me for my entire career. It's become this thing called deep learning, which you may have heard of. And at the root of this whole field is questions about what it means to be human and whether or not machines can be human too. There's three grand unanswered questions right now that arise in this. The first one is, it all came at once. How would we build a truly conscious machine, an artificial mind? That's one question that no one knows how to answer right now. And you'd think that that's pretty bad, but the second question is even worse. Is it possible for us to build a machine with consciousness, an artificial mind? Is that even possible? We don't even know. We don't know how to do it, and we don't even know if it's in principle possible. And the last question, the most befuddling of all, let's say we could. Let's just grant that we could, and we made it. How do we be able to tell that it's conscious or not? We don't even know that yet. Now, with those three questions on the table, it should remind us all that we don't know the first thing about what makes us who we are. A fundamental thing, because one thing I do know is I think, therefore I am. And I'm pretty convinced that you have a mind too. You're not a simulation. With Dr. Chow up here pretending to be an automaton, we know he's pretending, right? We know he has a mind. But on these basic things, these basic features of our human experience, we don't even know the first thing when it comes to these questions. And not only that, we don't even know how to make progress. Now, what I mean by this actually comes out in the very beginning of the field. This is Alan Turing, and he had a test. It's called Turing's test for a mind. So this question was at his mind. So what he did is he's the one who invented, they say, the notion of a digital computer or a universal computer. He proved that you can do any computational effort that can be done with a single machine, if that machine is constructed correctly. Before that point, people didn't know that. And that's what we actually see in our computers. You can actually, or even in your phone, you pull out your phone, it can do a whole bunch of stuff just by downloading stuff off the app. It's not because you're downloading new transistors that are being plugged in new ways. It's just merely that it's a universal machine. You get a different program, and it can do new things. That idea was his. And then what arose from that is, well, is it possible we can make a program that is conscious, that can just emulate the human? That's what was behind the question. And a lot of people were very skeptical of this. He said, well, this is how we're going to show that we can do it. It's called Turing's test. And you can see 3 rooms here. There's 3 people. They're the stick figures. And then you see a computer right there. He said, well, if we put a person in one room and we don't tell him what's going on in the other rooms, and we allow him to basically chat with them, he didn't have, this is like the beginning of Twitter right here, or Slack or whatever sorts of chatting systems you have here. He thought of it right here before even computers were invented. And he asked, well, if you can chat back and forth with the human and with the machine, and the person right there asking the questions, person A, if he can't actually tell which one is human and which one is a machine, well then that means that the machine is conscious. That's what his idea was. Now, it's an important idea. A lot of people have thought about it, but the question that comes to me is, well, how do we know if it's actually really having a mind, or if it's just emulating or simulating a person? Because I don't really know what's going on inside, and we're making a statement about the inside, but just what's going on the outside. Now, a much more cogent thinker than I, John Searle, wrote in 1980 about the Chinese room experiment. It's another thought experiment. So this is a cartoon of it. So the idea here is, you can see there's a little man in there. He's not a very smart man. He only speaks English, just like me. And there's some people out there who speak Chinese, like you. You're the smart people, okay? Well, I think most of you speak Mandarin or Chinese or Cantonese, right? Well, not everyone. The Indians in the room, you speak like Hindi or Tamil or whatever. There's like the poor, stupid American who comes, he only speaks English. And what he does have, though, is like an instruction book in English that he can basically get notes passed to him in Chinese. And we can make it a bit more complex. We know it's going to be hard. So maybe he has a big staff of people that all speak English, and they have this instruction book, and they can start manipulating squiggles, because that's all they are to him. They're not Chinese characters. And at the end of the day, he can respond to questions in Chinese by just manipulating things from this instruction book, like a universal computer, and spit things out, the little slots. So, we have Chinese speakers putting questions into him, and he kind of goes through this activity and then spits out stuff. In principle, maybe that's possible. Let's say it is possible. In fact, maybe it'll be actually observable in our lifetime, and certainly, we'll find out soon. Now, John Searle asked the question, does that man inside understand Chinese? And I think it's self-evident that he doesn't. Yet he can go through a process to produce Chinese. So then this seems to be a very puzzling problem. The question is, if we understand all the workings of the Chinese room, and it doesn't involve any understanding of Chinese, but the room itself can speak Chinese, is the room thinking? And most people, at least instinctually, I certainly look at that and say, I don't think the man speaks Chinese. He's doing an activity that produces Chinese, but he's not actually understanding it. And you can see how this is related to the Turing problem, right? Because maybe I'm just chatting with a machine that has an artificial mind, and I'm confused, and I think it has a mind, but it really doesn't. It's just a Chinese room. Now, there's a couple things that have happened that have really started to make us think deeper about what it means to be human. The first is advances from neuroscience. Do you see that image there of all those little dots on the screen? You can't see it that clearly, but those are copies of hand-drawn drawings of a really important scientist. His name is Ramon y Cajal. He's from Spain. He's one of the greatest scientists from Spain. He gets a Nobel Prize for those drawings. They are actually of neurons in the brain. Neurons are cells that are in our brains that are actually what helps us think. These are intricate drawings. What he did is he actually found a way to use silver to stain slices of a brain in a way that he could then go look under a microscope and see the intricate structure. He started looking at the structure of these things, and he was able to infer that the dendrites, these little projections on the side, the mossy part of it, they're getting information. They're processing it and sending out information through the axon, or the big, long, thick part of it. And that's how the brain works. He was right, and that was over 100 years ago. Isn't that amazing? Now, it's gotten even more detailed and precise than that. What it's kind of like is that we're pulling back the curtain on the Chinese room. And we can look at the human brain. We can see all the proteins that are there, all the cells that are there. We don't understand it at all, to be clear. But it's like we're seeing the curtain go back, and we're seeing a whole bunch of people running around following things in an instruction booklet. And then it makes us ask the question, then wait a minute, is the brain really thinking? Because when we see the Chinese room, we think, well, the brain's not thinking. But yeah, that actually is not that bad of a description of us. And it's a little bit unsettling when you think about it, because I'm pretty sure I think there I am, but then I look at that, and I look at this connection, and I have to think now, what is it that allows me to be conscious? I don't know precisely. I remember talking to a scientist at my university, and we were talking about this to a group of incoming applicants. You know, the thing about science is you end up usually getting focused on the small questions, but we're all connected to the large questions, grand questions. So there's a group of applicants to get into the program at WashU. WashU is like one of the top universities in science in the country and really the world. So we have very competitive applicants. We're really trying to impress them all. And it's funny, you know, if you get interviewed, ever invited to do an interview at a place, often they're really just trying to convince you to come. You're probably already in the door. Anyways, I was talking to these students, and the question of consciousness came up. There was another professor there. He said, well, we know what consciousness is. I'm like, really? That's great. Tell us then what consciousness is. He says, well, it's just basically, you know, receptors in our brain kind of doing things. And I'm like, what? All the students are like, what? What do you mean? He's like, well, we know that we have consciousness and brains work that way, so that's what consciousness is. I said, that doesn't answer anything interesting or important. So yes, we know that cells with receptors floating around, G protein coupled receptors and signaling cascades and neural networks in a biological sense produce consciousness. That's self-evidently true. But that doesn't actually answer anything interesting. It doesn't tell me, for example, if I can now implement consciousness in a computer. Nor does it tell me how. Nor does it tell me how to know if that computer is conscious. And he was a little annoyed. I'm not supposed to disagree with another professor like that. At least not in front of the people we're trying to impress. But I think what's going on here is that what's most interesting about this, like most things, is not precisely the answers, but the questions themselves. It's supposed to draw us into that. That's what makes them grand. We're going to learn a lot through neuroscience, but as we're learning about neuroscience, we still aren't getting any closer to understanding how to answer those questions. The other really interesting development is advances in machine intelligence. So if you look at the right, you'll see AlphaGo, which is done by Google DeepMind. And you all know Go, so it's interesting. So everyone thought back in the 1960s when computers were first invented that just go to about 10 years or so, we'll be able to get a conversant computer that passes Turing's test. But chess, that's really hard. That's going to take a long time. Turns out not to be the case. It's actually fairly easy to write a pretty good chess program. It's very hard to write a program that can understand language. Our perceptions were all off on that. Now, these were all a bunch of like Westerners. What wasn't even in their view was Go. It turns out the programs that we use to solve chess don't work on Go. The reason why is that in the mid-game for chess, there's about 25 different possibilities that you can move things. And so there's like a branching factor of that in the tree. But when it comes to Go, there's way more places you can put the stone, right? And that makes it much, much harder. Now, I don't know the precise status, but it was a very big deal recently where a neural network, DeepMind, was actually able to play competitively with Go. Not just, and what's interesting about this too is it's not because it's had all the rules of Go encoded in it. It learned from playing lots and lots of games with itself. So it learned from a structure how to do it. And it's doing it really well, which is surprising. Now, what's particularly important about it is that that's the exact same sort of tricks that I use in my own research to study other things. There's something general about it, too. What is it? Now, I'm not going to get into all the details, but it's really not that much different than matrices, matrix math. It's a bunch of numbers being pushed around. If you look at artificial intelligence under the hood, if you go for graduate school on that, you'll find out that it is actually nothing more than a Chinese room. So the question is, does DeepMind understand Go? We don't know how to even understand and answer that question. We know that it can play, but does it understand? Does it understand it the way we do? We don't know. So getting to my research, I look at a lot of problems in chemistry. That's not the only thing I do. I'll just talk about that. So we have an organic chemist on the left. She's a brilliant person writing down structures, looking at them, trying to understand things about quantum mechanics and metabolism and all that sort of stuff. And if you look just to the right of it, you can see some cartoons, which are just cartoons of like the structure of some of the artificial minds we've created. And I say that in question marks. More commonly, we'll call them networks or models. And that we're coloring interesting things that are going on in the molecules to the right. And that puts it into the same language as an organic chemist. I'm not going to explain precisely what this is right now. But that's similar to how an organics chemist would describe and think about it, as about parts of a molecule that are more reactive or more likely to change or to be metabolized or what have you. And then we can actually build these models that can learn in the same way how the models learn how to play Go. They can start learning a lot of organic chemistry. I take this to organic chemists, and they don't trust matrix math. It's a Chinese room. But then I'll start showing them these notes from the Chinese room. And it's interesting. They're like, oh, it's understanding some chemistry here. They'll say that. And it's funny, at times we'll be at the point where we'll say, hey, it actually got a different answer than we would do, and that answer is right. And we can even tease out why it got the right answer and we didn't. And so we're creating an artificial mind for organic chemistry. It's a little bit strange because it has a generalness to it. It's the exact same principles by which they made AlphaGo. And we're getting to a point where the Turing test may be thoroughly passed in our generation. And there was a really interesting thing that happened. There's many variants of it. This is just one variant. So you can get this as an app on just about any phone now. It's called Google Assistant. And when this was announced, I encourage you to go look at YouTube at it. What happened was, as we were testing this thing, what they did is they said, well, I wonder if we can get this machine to basically go call a restaurant and book a reservation for you, or to go do this or that as like a task online. And they didn't tell people ahead of time. That's what it was. What they did is just have the computer pick up the phone. Well, not pick up the phone. I mean, it doesn't have a body, right? But you can get a computer to dial a number, right? And then to not tell that person what's happening, and then just have a conversation with that person to get what you need. And they showed several recordings of people having a pizza being ordered. Or that, with all of the hiccups that happen through that, of a person not really being able to understand, having to have it repeated another way, going on off on a little tangent, all of that sort of stuff. They're listening on the phone, and they don't realize it's a machine. Crazy, right? I have a good friend, Clinton here, who's here in Hong Kong. He says, I looked at that. I'm not impressed. They weren't trying to figure out if it was a machine or not. Yeah, it's a modified Turing test, all right? And the point is, when we look at it, if we're in on the joke, if we're in on it, we know that we know, I even say that in quotes, we're pretty sure, we're certain, we don't actually think that Google Assistant has a mind. We think that it is merely matrix math. It's programming, it's just a program. That's not what other people on the line thought. So we're in on the joke, we know what's going on, we're asking different questions, and we think different, we also see it. We've seen the curtain go back, and we know. But they didn't. It's interesting. And you're right, if we're trying to ask, maybe we'd figure this one out, but give it another 10 years, give it another 20 years, at some point, we might get to the point where we could actually tell. We couldn't tell what it was. Now, how could we tell? The harder part is not actually going to be convincing us in a Chinese room experiment. It's going to be creating a body that looks human enough not to tip us off that it's not. I mean, that's how you know for a fact Dr. Chow was not just a robot, because robots can't walk like that. They don't look like that. And so what we're going to be faced with really soon, we are already, is actually experiencing this befuddling reality, is that we can't answer some of the most important questions about what it means to be human. We don't know how to build consciousness. We don't even know if we can build consciousness. And if we did, there's no way to tell, no principled way to tell if the machine we built actually is conscious. I'd say it goes even deeper than that. Let's say we can be successful, and let's say we solve this problem, we know it's a conscious machine. Is this conscious machine going to have a grandparent? I don't know. I think if we ever have a conscious machine, they're going to be about as different from us as we are from chimpanzees. They're not going to have the same experience. They're not going to be human in that way. I mean, maybe we can trick it to thinking it is, but it won't actually have those things. It's an interesting moment. There's something distinct about what it means to be human. We're not entirely unique. We're not the only animals that use tools, but we use tools in a very different way. We're not the only animals that have grandparents, but we have a distinct way of holding grandparents. We're not the only animals that grieve, but we have a different way of grieving. Whatever you look at, there's something distinct about humans it's one of the grand mysteries of our moment. What does it mean to be human? And I want to encourage you to think about that question. One challenge I had working through as an Asian in an academic world is thinking exclusively about my profession. Just getting a good grade so my parents wouldn't get really upset with me. Can you guys identify with that? Now, there's something actually dehumanizing about that. Yeah, we need to please our parents, and yes, we need to get good grades, do the best we can. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying to be a dropout. But if that's all we do, if that's everything, we're missing out on the grand conversation. Because I tell you what, one of the things that is distinctive about the human condition is that we're lost in contemplation of the grand questions. That's when we're sometimes the most human. There are no chimpanzees having McDonald lectures on what it means to be a chimpanzee. Nor are there gorillas having conversations over dim sum about what it means to be a gorilla. There isn't. And nor are there computers chatting behind the scenes in whatever language it is that they have about what it means to be a computer. Part of what it means to be a human is to ask this unanswerable question. This question that is, once again, where all great art and literature is, where there are wrong answers and there are right answers, but there's no definitive ends to the question. That's why it's a grand conversation. I guarantee you, you'll ask the question if you're the most human you can be. Your parents have, generations before have, and generations to come will too. Don't be merely about your career. Don't be merely about the good grades. Engage the grand questions too. And it connects us to a grand narrative. You know, this whole question about grandparents, I think, is very deeply important. We have a concept of ancestry. That's humans. The other animals don't. We have a sense, we have actually knowledge is a better way to put it. It's not subjective. We have knowledge that we descend from a long chain of being. That our fathers, our mothers had fathers and mothers too, and they had fathers and mothers too, and they had fathers and mothers too. Going back farther than human memory. And there's something meaningful about that. I'm an immigrant, and I'll end with this. The decisions of our ancestors impact us. Your decisions will impact future generations. A decision that my parents made was, even though they had been born and raised in India, it was to immigrate to the United States. Because they did that, I was born in Southern California. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is a separate issue. Maybe you think it's a bad thing. But I'll tell you what, it entirely altered my world. In a counterfactual world where my parents had stayed in India, I would have learned a different language. I would have had a different culture. I would have probably married someone else. Caleb, my son, probably wouldn't exist. And I had no part in the decision for them to come here, because I didn't exist yet either. That's how profoundly our decisions affect people. And isn't that beautiful too? Whatever you want to think about your life, know that it's important. And come join the grand questions and the grand conversations with us. Thanks a lot.
I wondered, have you read the book Bach, Extra, and Gödel? That book talk about consciousness. I mean, Bach, Escher, and Gödel all talk about self-referential. When you have a self-referential system, Gödel talk about some, getting into logical, inconsistency. Well, I'm really not smart enough to understand the whole book, but I think the theme of the book is consciousness is really some kind of self-referential activities. And the author speculate if one day the computer can think about its own thinking, maybe it's the beginning of consciousness. I just wonder how you think about that.
I think that's, so the question is, some people have said that a key part of a mind is having a sense, self-reflectiveness, to have a sense of self and a self-referentiality. What I'd say is that that's too simplistic of a response, because it's very easy to write a computer program that's self-referential. Just put a list that within itself, in a way, right? Have like a pointer that points to itself. That's self-referential in the most simple sense. But that isn't really what we're getting at. What we're getting at is like a true sense of self. But the problem is that we don't really know what's going on in a computer's mind. I mean, we could talk to it maybe one day, but we don't know if it's just a chatbot we're talking to that has a pre-encoded answer, and if it's emulating a sense of self, or it really has a sense of self. That's the distinction that we don't really have a clear solution to yet. So yeah, so maybe that is a key piece of it, where it becomes self-aware, but how do we know if it's become self-aware, or just telling us it's self-aware when it's not?
Other questions? There's a question here from this gentleman.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So as a biologist, I guess you would be aware of previous attempts in the history of science to understand the phenomena of life. And this notion of life was something that was debated among scientists in, say, the early 20th century or prior to that and throughout all philosophy. And previous attempts were looking for that one thing which is life, that one vital spirit or primal essence or so on. And with the development of science in the 20th century, it turned out that there isn't such a thing. Like, we don't need such a thing to explain what life is. Life is not one thing. It's a set of processes that can all be explained in their own terms, and the sort of notion, this notion of life sort of dissolves away, that we're not looking for one thing, which is life in and of itself, as having some essential property. So with that story in mind, do you think that might our search for what is consciousness, or the mind as such, also follow a similar trajectory, where consciousness is not one thing with this essence that we need to pin down, but when we break up consciousness into discrete functions that we can understand in cognitive scientific terms, might the mystery go away to what is consciousness, or what is it to have a mind?
Yeah, certainly mystery could go away, but that's usually because we're killing the mystery that's there by accepting a simple answer. And I would say what you just explained about life is a perfect example of that. So one of the grand questions is, why is there life and not just non-life? Because even if we can entirely explain how life arises by purely natural scientific causes, there's no reason why it had to be that way. So we're still left with this puzzle of why. The only way to foreclose that question at this point is by lacking curiosity. Now, I am a scientist. I'm curious. I can't kill that curiosity. I'm very curious. Now, what you're talking about is a larger conversation about, is there something that's profoundly different about life? And some people call it vitalism and non-life. What we found out is that a lot of the tools that we use to study the physical world of non-life end up, if we turn them now to living things, we can get pretty far. We find out that some of the distinctions we have aren't nearly as clear. Like a lot of the rules we learned about thermodynamics, looking at gases, actually still apply to the molecules inside of us. There's like a fuzzy boundary between organic chemistry, which is the chemistry of life, and physical chemistry, which is the chemistry of things that aren't life. It's a fuzzy boundary. In fact, a way how we can't even really precisely define life. Whatever definition you have, there's boundary cases where maybe are exceptions to the rule. So yeah, at the extremes we know what life is and non-life, but there's this fuzzy thing, like is a virus life? Is a plasmid life, even though it replicates and it can bounce around between different places? What is a transposon life? I know these are technical terms. The biologists in the room will know what I'm talking about. Are prions life? These are questions that we wonder about, and we don't have a clear, objective way to actually adjudicate that. We find out that the boundary between life and non-life is much more fuzzy than maybe we initially think. And moreover, when we look at, for example, fully intact humans, and we kind of see how they operate and we work, we find out that we work by these really understandable rules, right? That are understood through actually, studying non-life systems. So that's what you're getting at. But I'll tell you what, there's really nothing in that account that tells us much about Beethoven. So if you look at an amazing painting, let's say the Mona Lisa, you can decompose it and look at its individual parts. It doesn't tell you that much about her smile. There's something that happens at a higher level, and there's actually become a concept that's arisen in science that's called emergence. About there's certain things that they can't actually be explained reductively, but they happen at a higher level. So we know that life is emergent. We know that consciousness is emergent too, which is a truth. It's almost a truism, but that's almost a statement to just say that we don't actually know how to make sense of how to move from the lower level to the higher level in these cases. So what I would say is, I would just challenge the premise that life has really been entirely explained. I think it's still a puzzle. It's still a mystery. It's still beautiful, even though it's true that it follows natural laws, and we can make sense of it in a lot of ways, and we study it very reductively. But to think that that's the whole story, I think, does a disservice to the truth of the question.
Right. Other questions? Yes, there's a question there and here as well. So we can, from this gentleman here, and also to Peter over there. So whoever gets the mic first can ask the question. Okay.
Do I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
I have a ridiculous question. If man believe in God, so God should exist, and therefore God created man. So how can we disprove that God could have created a machine or any other objects, and therefore not instill in them consciousness?
I do not understand the question. Can someone help me understand it? Do you understand it?
Well,
Yeah.
it's kind of ridiculous because I think, when I look at how Buddhists explain existence, material existence, is comprised of emptiness. And substance becomes in existence that we can perceive is because of the energy that surrounds it. Roughly, that's the way it is. So basically, it's nothingness everywhere. However, because of some energy production, because of the speed of whatever it is.
So we're talking about it from a Buddhist point of view. So is this about God or is it about Buddhism?
Well, I'm trying to link the two together
Okay.
in a way, because I don't know if God exists. But
Okay.
man does believe,
So what I would say is, in that sense that people believe in God, the concept of God certainly exists, but that's different than saying that concept of God is actually realized in the world independent of humans and not a product of humans. So, and then that's also an independent question about whether or not reality exists. So if all of this is in our heads, then you can wonder if just the fact that we have a consciousness, that makes God just as real as you or me, because I'm just imagining you. But I would say that there's something different about how I come to being a Christian that makes it harder. So I'll tell you that the commonality that's important between Buddhism and Christianity is that they both are oriented around making a response to suffering.
Of course, yes. That's
Like
true.
suffering is a foundational piece of Buddhism, and the foundational question of Christianity is centered around suffering too.
And dealing with death.
And they give different answers.
Yes.
So, and I don't mean to create a cartoon of everyone's beliefs. There's just not a lot of time, so I can't get into the whole story. But the simple answer for what the Buddhist answer is that suffering is being bound to a false reality of this world. This world that we see around us is actually not real. What you see as suffering is really just not real. We need to detach from it and be like the lotus that floats above the water and reach enlightenment. Okay? That's the Buddhist response in a nutshell. So it comes with all the problems of being a nutshell. Like I said, I hope I'm not offending anyone. Now, the response in Christianity is centered on this person, Jesus, and his response to suffering is different. He sees people suffering, and instead of saying that world is an illusion, that material reality is an illusion, I'm just going to get you all out of it, what he does is he actually enters into it and lives a life of immense suffering because he sees there's value in this world that's worth participating in the suffering to actually attain. So Jesus, if the Christian story is true, didn't have to do that, but he comes to experience a very human understanding of a grandfather and a human understanding of parents. He comes to that because he thinks that that's valuable enough to suffer and die on a cross. It's a very different view of suffering. And what also comes out of this is that when we talk about God, I don't mean merely an idea in my head. I do have an idea in my head, but I'll tell you, that idea in my head is just merely a shadow, an imperfect representation of something that is far too grand for me to fully understand. In fact, maybe I'm not much different than Noam Chomsky. Using sign language, trying to communicate with God who understands something much grander than me, but he's come down to my level talking, without his equivalent of compound nouns, just so I can make sense of it. And I just need to understand my place, that I'm lucky to be in community with him, but there's no chance I have to fully understand this real thing that doesn't need me, that exists outside myself, who actually sees the suffering that I go through in my life as worth entering into too. So that just lays out the differences. We don't have enough time to really get into it. We'll talk about it afterwards.
Okay, fine.
I think the question it raises the question about who or what your God is, because if you're talking about consciousness, in that sense, I mean, if God is a kind of machine, there's no reason why we would have a kind of consciousness, or we should even be concerned about it, right? I mean, does God need to be a person? I mean, that's really the question, I think, that's being asked in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, so is God, so some scientists I talk to say, I believe in God. God is the laws of the universe. I mean, that's one conception of God, for sure. I would say that doesn't really give a full account. I mean, maybe that's part of the story, but in the same way, yeah, like what is it to be human? We can talk about neurons and how they're connected, and we can talk about the Chinese room, but there's more to it than that. There's another level where it seems like we have intentions and a will and hopes and dreams, and you're going to start with the assumption, even from this conversation, that I'm a person too that experiences reality. That's, even though I'm from a different culture, and I probably talk too fast, and I have different skin color than most people in this room. Like, there's a sense where you still know that I experience the world largely consistent with you, right? Even though I'm nothing more than a Chinese room from a scientific point of view. And I think that's the types of questions it begs to say that, you point all to those things. So yeah, maybe that's true of God too, or it's part of what's going on. But even then, as a Christian, what's still left, well, not even as a Christian, just as a person looking at it, there's an immense amount of order to the world. How did that order arise? If God is natural laws, where did the natural laws come from? And it really raises the question of, like, if that's our conception of God, maybe there's even a bigger concept of God where there's someone who actually made it.
Sure.
And I would say there's 4 grand questions, really truly grand ones. We dealt with one of them today. What does it mean to be human? How did the human mind arise? Like, we look through all of the lives of the universe's history, we see lots and lots of different lives of life. We don't ever see anything that's a human. Except in our imagination, we imagine human animals all the time. when we go to the movie theater, when we see talking animals, those are human animals. We see those all the time. We don't actually see them here. Like, if you go out into the jungles and try and have a conversation with a tiger, it's not going to go so well. We don't see human animals. That's one of the grand questions. Another grand question is, how did consciousness arise? That's another question we dealt with. Because it could have been just a whole bunch of different varieties of plants and microbes. Why is it there's conscious animals that are there? It's a puzzle. It didn't have to be that way, yet it is. Why is it that way? We don't know. Another grand question we touched on is, why is there life in addition to non-life? It didn't have to be that way. It could have all just been like, inert rocks. We see a lot of inert rocks when we look in telescopes at places. We see a whole lot of inert non-life. Why is there life? But it goes even deeper. This gets to the 4th grand question, or maybe the first one if I did it in order. Why is there something rather than nothing? There could have been nothing. Yet there's something. Now, we can talk about the natural laws, like, CP violations and that sort of stuff. If you're a physicist, you know what I'm talking about. But it didn't have to be that way. It could have been different. It's all contingent on things that we don't really have a good account for. These are grand puzzles. Now, even if science fully answers them from a law-like point of view, it still doesn't give us a true answer for why those things are the way they are. And for me as a Christian, those are grand questions that seem to make sense to me if God actually had the desire to do it, to create a context where there's something rather than nothing, where life arises instead of just being non-life, where consciousness arises instead of just being plants and microbes, and where humans arise rather than just having chimpanzees running around. That makes a lot of sense because there's no reason why those things had to be, yet they are.
Right. Peter, you have a question? Yes.
I think you just answered my question, because I was going to jump into, right, we spoke a lot, or it was a lot mentioned on continuous with other animals, and then discontinuous more than just animals in the context of grandparents, language, consciousness, etc. but I didn't hear much on in the image of God, and I guess those 4 grand questions really then from a scientific perspective sort of start to unpack that of what does it, why may we be in the image of God?
Yeah, so that's a larger question, which we'll be getting into a lot more depth tomorrow, but I'll answer by saying that the image of God is an interesting rhetoric that's been important, where it points to this notion that there's something about the human condition that points to something greater than where we came from. We come from dust, but it points to something. There's an image of something. What I'd say is that it's a theology or a way of understanding where we come from that actually can give an account for how it's even possible that we can have that conversation with God in the first place. That God actually wanted to have that from the beginning, how he created us. That's one important piece of it. But I'd say that when you go actually talk to scholars in this area who have studied this really closely, there's many different views, actually, it turns out, of what the image of God is. They fall into about 3 different classes. One is the notion that our substance is in the image of God. There's something that's common about us and God. So some philosophers would point to the fact that we have reason. We have the ability to logically reason about things. And animals don't have that in the same way that we do. So in Catholic thought, that's the rational soul. That's where that comes out. Aquinas is really big on that. And it's tightly bound sometimes as it's called like a structural view. That's one view. Second view is something called a relational view of the image of God, that we're actually able to be in relationships with one another. And you'll know what I mean by this in the sense that, that there's something beautiful about individual humans, but there's also something different that arises out of our community. So individual humans are wonderful. We're talking a lot about grandparents, but there's also something beautiful that arises when you watch a son take care of their aging parents with incredible love, even though there's nothing anymore they can get out of it, right? There's like something beautiful in that relationship. Or even when a handicapped child is taken care of by their parents, when they're not going to give to society nearly as much as they're going to get, but there's something deeply valuable about it, and something comes out in that relationship that speaks to something greater, right? And then the fourth way is something called a functional or vocational view, or a sense that God has ordained us for a purpose to represent him here. And that's actually very important too, where it means that we're not actually here just for our goals, to just get our careers, that we're actually here to do something in this world. We're here to be stewards of the world. We don't want the environment to fall apart. We are here to create a society that outlasts us, that's good. And so that's the third piece. And you don't have to pick and choose and say, I think it's this and not that. Maybe all 3 of them are happening at once. So that's how scholars are thinking about it. Martin Luther King is another person I look to. He also grounds, I don't know if this is a precise way to think about it, but I think that one of the things that's unique, I would say, to humans, and in that sense it's maybe more the substance view, is that at least I believe, and many people, this is one thing, I mean, we don't have to like everything that the West does, but this is one thing I think they have a good point on, is that every human, no matter if they're poor or rich, or kind or unkind, or even evil or good, or if they're handicapped or not, I believe that they all have, they're endowed with equal rights and dignity. So even that child that has like mental illness and maybe will never even be able to communicate as well as Nim Chimpsky because there's a problem with him, I think that there's like intrinsic dignity to that human that was not given to any other animal that I know of. And there's something intrinsically, like people are ends in themselves in that sense.
Right, we're running out of time.
Sorry, I could kind of go on. I answer long.
We have one more, any burning question? Because if you have a burning question, if this is one there, there's 3 burning questions, 4. Well, and I know you had a question first, so maybe we'll do this one question, and maybe it'll solve all the other burning questions. Anyway, it'll be a good question.
Thank you.
No pressure.
My question is related to 2 of your comments. One is that part of us being human is that we ask a question, what does it mean to be human? And the other comment is that sometimes the human difference is actually the cultural difference instead of the biological difference. So you know, a lot of the questions that we are having about what it means to be human, you're trying to use theology to inspire some thoughts about it, but we know there are different theologies in the world, and Christian theology is one of them.
Yeah.
So, and
There's different Christian theologies, too.
Yes, as well. So relating to your comment about the cultural difference, this could be a personal question, and I hope you don't take offense. Would you say that you are a Christian and you use the Christian theology to inspire your thoughts about this question because you're first acculturated into the Christian, within the social environment that you grew up in? And would you continue to explore other theologies to fill in the blanks? Would you explore Islam, for example? It's also the fastest growing religion in the world, and other theologies that have perhaps slightly different explanations to some of the key grand questions.
So absolutely I would do that. And in the most important way, which will be true for my entire life, is I want to be in conversation with people, and different people think things, and isn't it more fun when we come with different ways of thinking about it? And you know, these are questions that don't have settled answers. So the reason why I'm talking to you from a Christian theology point of view is just because that's part of who I am. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I hope you understand it, even if you end up disagreeing with it. And you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I'll tell you, it's not because I didn't consider anything else and I was unculturated this way. When I mean, you can talk to, it's not that actually hard to find people who are Christian who were not raised that way. You don't have to go very far back in my history to see a lot of Hindus. And there was a point even in my life where I looked at this, and actually it was exactly that question. Someone asked me, you know, are you only Christian because your parents are Christian? And the answer at that time was, well, I guess yes. But I realized that that couldn't actually be true. That wasn't an honest type of life. I only wanted to be Christian if I could actually really believe it was true. Like, it wasn't enough to have it just be true. It was like a concept that works for me. Like, it's too grand of a claim. It has too many entailments on my life. I wanted to know that this is real, independent of me. This is true, independent of me, not just a figment of my imagination. And so I looked at this to see if there was anything that wasn't man-made. And I'll tell you, in Christianity, I found an immense number of things that were man-made, that weren't perfect, that were broken, that didn't make sense, that were clearly driven by culture. If you want to get a sense of what I mean by this, just go and visit a group of churches. You'll see that they're all so different. You start talking to people why, you'll find out, oh, it's because this is really man-made. And I would say that if I'd never found something that wasn't man-made, I'm pretty sure I'd be an atheist right now. Maybe I'd be talking to you. Maybe I'd still be a professor. It just wouldn't be a McDonald lecture I'd be invited to. But I did find one thing that wasn't man-made. And that's why I'm a Christian. That one thing I found is this thing that happened 2,000 years ago. It seems like all these little clues about, you know, why did those 4 things turn out the way they did? They're just weird things in the world. And maybe you think that we just got lucky. And maybe we did. But the one thing that tips it over for me and say, well, no, I don't think it's that we just got lucky, is when I encountered this person, Jesus, in history, who, the foundational claim of Christianity is that he came to earth, experienced the suffering with us because he thought we were valuable enough to do that for. And then he died on a cross. He was murdered publicly. And then 3 days later, he rose from the dead. Now, what's so remarkable about this is that this has never happened before in history quite like this. A lot of people would imagine that people in the very distant past rose from the dead, but this is different. Like, his brother, who did not like his ministry while he was alive, becomes a Christian after he dies, believing that he rose from the dead. That's strange. And it's not that he's doing this for personal gain, because he doesn't really have power. It's like all the apostles that have power, yet his own family were skeptics of him while he's alive. But when something happened that changed that, so everyone at that time come to believe that he's alive. And you look, and I looked into to see, well, you know, is this just like a myth? And you know, you start looking and seeing what actually people are digging up out of the ground and what's there. I saw something that really appears to be a grand intelligence, a grand mind from beyond our full experience, deciding to make himself known to all people. I mean, not just white people, not just Jewish people. I'm an Indian, you guys know that, right? I found not an American God. not a Western person. I found an Eastern person who ended up reordering everything. I would say that's maybe another one of the grand questions of like what actually happened 2,000 years ago that altered so much of the world. I mean, something changed there in a way that you can't precisely say about anything about other things. I mean, I'm not saying that other things haven't had an influence, but there's something that ends up spreading over the entire world, capturing people from all sorts of backgrounds that were raised Christian, that were not raised Christian, that were raised Jewish, not Jewish, of all sorts of personalities and types. And I would just say that what I think happened is that they saw the risen Jesus. And I'd say I saw him too, in a sense. So that's why I'm a Christian. It's not just because I was raised that way.
Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you. And that was a lovely answer. We've run out of time.
Sorry.
So we've run out of time. But before we go, let's thank Swamidass for a really wonderful evening. Thank you.